somebody, I only caught wind of it today, somebody climbed ours on Saturday and fell to death.
Really?
You know who responded?
You?
Joe Stoker.
Oh, did he?
He
Oh.
called me on the way.
So the body ended up being like the Regal parking lot, I heard? Like, was because he must have been that
On
high.
that other side of it.
I wonder if it was the same.
That's what we're wondering.
Might have been.
I caught wind of it, well, actually I caught wind last night because I was cutting the 6 and 11. And someone was telling me. That
And this happened when?
Saturday, I think
Oh,
he said.
geez.
Was it Saturday?
Joe called me. I think that's when it was.
Wow.
Might have been the same.
Yeah, Saturday.
Yeah. Because yours was like a suicide, right?
Yeah,
Like
well,
a top.
I don't know, he just said like,
But then you talk them down and they go to a different town. That seems weird. Like, but it's, that's the first thing everybody said. It must have been the same.
Correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't there one that was not jumping like the guy? There was somebody who was jumping
Yeah.
for the thrill.
So
and they had
Danilo
the
and I
bag on.
were working overnights, and I remember I was the other. He was a shooter. He was gone for coffee, and we used to have security overnight. And the guy goes, "Oh, these cops in our parking lot." The security cops. There's no clue what's going on. And I go back. Someone had called the cops because they saw them hop the fence from the top side, and then they had parachutes on their back. So they didn't get too far off because, you know, D district's pretty close, so when someone saw hop the fence,
Yeah.
cops were there pretty quick. But yeah, I remember shooting, so I'm running for my deer, it's all locked up because Danilo
Right.
was a shooter. I wasn't doing take-home car gear then. So I'm like running to my locker, grabbing my shit, and running up in the parking lot.
Yeah.
And I got them loading these kids into a car.
Right, it was somebody from there. That's what Joe was worried about. He goes,
That's not really high
yeah.
enough for a
Yeah.
parachute
Yeah.
to help.
What's that?
It's not really high enough for a parachute to help.
yeah, by the time it opens, you're hitting the
You're
ground.
already on
Well, I
the
guess a
ground.
couple people have done the Colden Tower in the past, and one guy, I guess, Woody was telling me, got hurt pretty bad because there's all those wires that like support it.
Yeah.
I mean, those go out pretty wide.
I know somebody did our Colden Tower, like
21
to 25 years.
Oh, sure,
They're
yeah, we
released
put
on
something
Friday,
out,
right?
yeah, on
Okay.
Friday, yep,
That's all I
yes,
can
sir.
think
I'll
of.
let her know, yeah. Yeah,
That was
yes.
one quick one.
Yeah, I never really
Yeah.
thought of that like one of our
Okay,
employees.
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's the last place I want to die. I didn't want to be there alive. I want to
Right.
I think we're screaming it. Yeah. Oh boy, well, hopefully that bike's not picking me up.
Now everybody watching the stream wants to hear that story, not this story.
Yeah, you're in trouble now. So who doesn't have their NEXUS card?
I don't even have a enhanced license.
I have that, I don't have it.
I have I have my passport, which I always chose that because it was more expensive, but
Yeah.
I really just gotta, my license is up soon, I think. I gotta get.
I don't have an enhanced license.
No?
Not allowed to.
Well, now,
You're not allowed to.
I'm not a US citizen.
oh, you're not?
Never knew that.
So you still have a Canadian license?
No, I have a US license.
You're a resident alien or?
Yes.
Gotcha.
You're
Well,
Canadian, nationally Canadian.
I'm a
or-
Canadian citizen.
Oh.
So I have a green card.
Isn't that what Bill does?
No.
He has the Nexus thing.
Bill has a
Nexus.
Yeah, I think Bill does have it.
Bill does,
So
yeah.
Bill lives there. Yeah, he comes in every day.
That's what we have evolved is the same thing.
Right. He's from
He's a
Canada.
US, no, he's from Boston, I think his wife is.
But he lives.
He lives in Canada.
Yeah.
Oh,
Jeez,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we all found out that one day that we wanted this like Buffalo Bills pizza last year. And, it was at this like place in Canada. And he's like, oh, I'll just bring it in on my way into work. And we're like, wait, what? You live in Canada? You know, I thought you were from Boston. And he does, so it must be his wife. I had a couple people, I remember, there was someone who used to come over from Fort Erie who worked. Oh, Jody Foster. You guys ever work with Jody Foster? He was Canadian, he lived in Canada, I don't know if he was Canadian.
I remember.
I like hearing now. He was, it was a he. Oh, but I know Jody, I know that Jody Foster.
That's not.
He was a truck, yeah, he was a truck driver for us.
Threw me off there.
Yeah, now we gotta get, what's that license, that's above an enhanced or below an enhanced? That one that
The
was
real
delayed
ID.
again, the real ID?
Real ID.
Is that a level below an enhanced or
I
above?
think, I want to say it might be.
Yeah, I feel like it is, I feel like it was like when I saw the picture, it might have been like.
Fort Greene it used to be.
Nice.
He used to be.
I had to rescue on the spot, that photo.
Yeah, it's cool.
It's so high. Mine's also doesn't look at mine, it's like high school. I was like, oh my God. You look like-
I got mine
I don't
at
even remember
DMV.
when I had a buzz cut, but apparently I got a picture from my license with a buzz cut.
Wow, I didn't
And I
renew
looked
mine
like
because
I'm on the way to Obama. And I was like, that does not look like you. No, I'd arrest me on site too. Yeah.
Airports don't like.
Yeah.
I actually got mine done at DMV, no longer exists.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, yeah, that was convenient, I didn't have one.
So I got it one day, so first off, I don't know why.
Was it like bad maintenance building, it was like a weird spot. Yeah.
But I was like, all right, I live in Springville, this is probably the closest thing. So, I went for it and I was like, I'm gonna get there real early. I didn't even sleep at all. I got there, well, I thought it was gonna be late.
We were lost.
I forgot to drop it. We still waited like 45 minutes.
I remember that being rough. The one downtown isn't bad if you make it.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's
We
okay.
were a little bit lost here.
You're not that
Hey.
late.
4 minutes doesn't count as late.
They can't find you.
Yeah. I made an appointment with downtown one,
You know what?
It's surprisingly great.
even the people who didn't have appointments were taking relatively right there. And but with an appointment, you're ahead of them.
I went without one and I literally shot right through the whole thing, no problem. That was probably 15 years ago.
We can talk now. Oh, okay, 5 minutes?
They forget that you're a real person.
All right, good morning. Thank you very much for being here. I'm here to announce that we are going to introduce legislation making NEXUS Work Act. It's legislation that would simply allow for virtual interviews for new and renewing NEXUS applications. As we know, there's been a significant backlog in issuing or getting appointments for a NEXUS card that was 16 months last fall. That's been reduced to between 12 and 14 months, but that's still too long a time. This is a pre-check, if you will. It's a pre-clearance program, and we intend to use the technology that's available to be able to do interviews remotely. Currently, under the leadership of Ron Reines, who is the general manager of the Peace Bridge, there is a project ongoing, but it requires an individual to go through 2 interview processes, one on the Canadian side with Canadian Customs and Border authorities, and then again on the American side with American Customs and Border Protection agents. It's time consuming and has significantly impacted the wait times that is required to actually go through the process and receive a NEXUS card. NEXUS was intended to be a trusted traveler program that would reduce waits at the places like the Peace Bridge. And unfortunately, because of the backlog, people aren't able to get the NEXUS pass, and it's creating significant time waits at the land ports of entry, including the Peace Bridge. But as I said, Ron Reines and his leadership team here undertook a project whereby that's moving forward, and it's had a meaningful impact on the time it takes to make an application, go through an interview process, and ultimately receive a NEXUS card. Why is this important? The U.S. and Canadian economies, the Western New York and Ontario economies are deeply integrated. Canadians spend in 2019 about $20 billion a year in the United States. Every aspect of our life here in Western New York is tied to reliable, predictable access to and from Canada, whether it's professional sports franchises, whether it's the retail economy. Buffalo Niagara International Airport, about 30% of people flying out of Buffalo Niagara International Airport are Canadian citizens, and the same is true with Western New York and Southern Ontario at least. But 38 million people live in Canada. About 40% of those live in Ontario. That is Fort Erie up through and including the greater Toronto area. So the greatest inducement to travel is ease of travel. And the U.S.-Canadian relationship took a hit over the past 3 years, 36 months during the pandemic. And we want to get this back on track so that we can both, United States citizens and Canadian citizens, enjoy the benefits of living in a border community. It's not only the economics that are important, it's also the life quality. So making NEXUS Work Act will allow the virtual interviews to take place, which should reduce the amount of wait times people are currently experiencing as it relates to making application, doing their interview, and ultimately receiving a NEXUS card. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Can you describe the typical NEXUS customer? Is it someone who maybe lives in one country, works in the other, or is it someone who maybe just is a traveler who comes over the border a handful of times a year?
Could be a combination of things. You know, a lot of people that live in Buffalo have summer homes, cottages in Canada. They're frequent users, and therefore they get a NEXUS card, which makes their wait considerably less than what otherwise would be without the NEXUS card. So I think there's a variety of users, and that's why the program was established. There's a separate lane. They have been, pretty much pre-cleared, and they're able to pass without a lot of wait. And if people don't respond well, the economy doesn't respond well to uncertainty and unreliability. And I think the NEXUS card is something that serves as an inducement to encourage travel between the United States and Canada. Sir.
When we last discussed this, it was in December, we were talking about a pilot program, and it allowed, and you have to do with that dispute, with the American guys going over there without the weapons.
Yeah.
Whatever. And then it was a pilot, I think it was being tried out here in December. What's the update on that?
Well, the update is that, as I said, under the leadership of Ron Reines here, you had a dispute between the countries as to who could do what where. And the workaround, and it's being demonstrated both here at the Peace Bridge and where else, Ron? Thousand Islands. You have two separate interviews, which is labor intensive, but it's also time consuming, where applicants can go to the Canadian side, be interviewed by Canadian officials, and then drive over to the American side. So that's two stops people have to make in order to go through that interview process. So this is a workaround that has resulted in a reduction in the backup of NEXUS cards, but this would be something that would, I think really have a major impact relative to expediting all this process.
In addition to this pilot we're doing now, because this would be the virtual interview, right?
Well, ideally, this would replace the situation as it currently stands. However, individuals may still have the option to do two interviews, but if you have an opportunity to do your interview with Customs and Border Protection from both the United States and Canada in a virtual situation, that would expedite the application process and approval process.
When we talked last time, it was told, you said the pilot program, when fully implemented, this workaround could allow the processing of 500 NEXUS applications weekly at Peace Bridge.
Yeah.
How's that gone? Are we at that, are we close to that?
No, it hasn't reduced it to the extent that we would like it to. And that's why utilizing technology to do the interviews would be a much better outcome. And right now, there was a pilot project in 2019, proof of concept they call it, for the Trusted Traveler program, whereby interviews were conducted virtually.
Do you think, Congressman, that there's something about the in-person across the table interview, the people that do them, I'm sure, are highly trained in terms of sizing people up. Do we lose any of that in a virtual sort of situation?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously, the pandemic, there were a lot of trends already in place, but they were accelerated during the pandemic because we couldn't meet in person. So I think the technology has gotten better. It will continue to get better relative to security, and I think it's a convenient way to utilize technology to reduce the time it takes to apply, go through the interview, and ultimately receive a NEXUS card. A 16-month wait is unacceptable. a 12 to 14-month wait. We can certainly improve on that, and by using the technology to do that interview and to get those NEXUS passes approved. Anybody else? Any other topics?
Yes.
Sure.
So there's the thought to, I guess, possibility of raising interest rates again, the Federal Reserve. We know it was done to try and curb inflation as a traditional path to take, but it's been done and done and done. And I'm thinking, you know, do you reach a point where you get a diminished return on that, and then all it causes is pain and suffering for people trying to buy homes? What's your thought? Have we reached a ceiling there where we get off to maybe not raise these anymore?
Inflation is not good for obvious reasons, and trying to curb it, I think, is the effort that the Federal Reserve has undertaken.
Yeah.
It's worked, not to the extent that we wanted to. So a further increase in interest rates, I would request that that be delayed until we see the full effect of what has already been done.
Congressman, this sort of relates to border, but back in September when you were in Niagara Falls, you made mention that you were looking to look deeper into the post 9/11 border
Yep.
restrictions. Once they were starting to drop the COVID restrictions, kind of where did you stand in that process? If there's been any movement in that process with further reviewing border restrictions between U.S. and Canada?
Yeah, I think that what typically happens when there's a crisis like 9/11, like the pandemic, you rather be safe than sorry. So I think restrictions are put in place, and then it's very, very difficult to pull those restrictions back. So we are reviewing the restrictions that have been put in place in 9/11 and also the pandemic to find ways like this, where we can utilize what's available to us today that wasn't available to us 20 years ago, that can make that cross-border experience better. I think that there is still enormous potential that is unmet for both Buffalo, the United States, and Canada as it relates to better use of the border and more efficient use of the border. It's kind of complicated, as we just experienced 15 minutes ago. And what people will do is they'll change their economic behavior to avoid the bridge altogether with too many restrictions in place. And we saw about a 40% reduction in traffic between the United States and Canada during the pandemic.
There's a report that was out there with some concerns with migrants coming across the northern border, especially more so in like Vermont and New Hampshire. But are there any further concerns? I mean, there's so much brought up about the southern border concerns,
Yeah.
but there are some inklings that the northern border, there could be people going back and forth and finding their way without going through proper ways.
Sure,
That
but
way.
I think that you have Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection for a reason in both the United States and Canada. These are highly trained professional law enforcement officers that are develop skills instinctively and learned that make them effective in determining whether or not somebody should be pulled over for additional screening. Those kinds of efforts will continue. We want the border to be safe, but we want it to be also accessible to people that legitimately are utilizing the border for employment, for pleasure, for tourism, all of those things that are very, very important to both economies. Buffalo and Western New York probably wouldn't have professional sports franchises if we didn't have the added fan base, ticket buying base in Ontario. The Sabres put that number at about 20%. I think the Bills are a little bit higher. But if you look through the economy of Buffalo and Western New York, healthcare, Canadians spend $15 million a year in healthcare in Western New York alone. So all of these issues, I think, are affected by the border experience, and we just want to make it as efficient and as effective as possible, keeping in mind that safety is a major concern as well.
Congressman Higgins, people receiving SNAP supplemental benefits learned this week that they'll receive a reduction in payments effective March 1st, passage of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of
Well, I would fight to try to get that elevated and not experience a reduction.
Seems like they've already passed something, it's almost
Yeah.
too late.
Well, no, not really. It's the distribution of those dollars once they become available. There may be a reason relative to demand or less demand in certain areas that may have reduced that, but I'll check into it, and we will do everything I can to, make sure that there is, an ample level of support for that program.
Congressman, you're introducing this piece of legislation today, and the other questions that you've been able to address regarding access between both borders. Do you believe it'll ever get back to normal in terms of pre-pandemic levels or anything of those sorts? Just getting back to finally a sense of normalcy without any COVID restrictions, any other post 9/11 restrictions?
Yeah, I think that's a benchmark that we want to exceed. I always believe that we do well relative to the management of the Peace Bridge, but I think we're doing it with one hand tied behind our backs. I think we can always do better, and it accrues to the benefit of both Canada and the United States to have increased travel between the United States and Canada, and particularly at this Peace Bridge. So we're always striving, I'm talking with Ron on a regular basis, just to find ways to improve access by use of technology, also infrastructure. Keep in mind that you have a Peace Bridge, which is 3 lanes, right? To move people between Western New York and a population center of 38 million people, the largest province in terms of population is Ontario. Buffalo is connected to Grand Island. Grand Island's a place of about 25 million people, and there are 4 lanes. So the challenge of making that experience as positive as possible deals with, efficiencies and proximity. So, getting that experience improved for people will induce travel. As I said before, the greatest inducement to travel is ease of travel. So always trying to find ways where we can improve. And we're finding that, when technology is available and it can be used for things like making NEXUS Work Act, we should take advantage of that. We should take advantage of infrastructure improvements that are being made at the Peace Bridge on a regular basis to make that experience better.
Any other under-the-radar sort of initiatives that you're hoping that the administration can make when it comes to ease of travel between the borders? Anything else that's kind of, that, maybe can be addressed now, but eventually once this can be addressed and this can be addressed, is there anything that's kind of like a longer-term outlook?
Well, if you're in a continuous improvement mode, you're going to find that those opportunities, some of which we are aware of now, like a project like this, proof of concept is already occurring under the Trusted Traveler program. So anything planned, not immediate, but we're always looking for ways to improve that situation.
The only reason I'll ask this question, because you represent Buffalo in Congress, but there's a lot of talk being generated about the fluoride situation in the city, with the lack of fluoride, I should say, but is there anything, from your perspective that you can say to that matter in terms of just thoughts or?
Well, that situation needs to be corrected, and as soon as possible, because that's a problem. We know that in older cities like Buffalo, the infrastructure is not as good as it could be, and the replacement of lead pipes is an important issue as it relates to residential communities within the city of Buffalo. But this issue needs to be dealt with as well, because that's a problem that our kids are going to be experiencing, and families are.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of upholding the pilot standards after 3407?
Well, they're critically important. The National Transportation Safety Board was dispatched to Buffalo the evening of the crash nearly 15 years ago, and they concluded that it was pilot error was a significant cause of that crash, and throughout a decades-long process, the minimum standards were put at 1,500 hours. There was a reason for that. Most people didn't know that there were two levels of safety. One for the larger carriers, but also a lower standard for regional carriers that had the same name, Continental and United and Delta. So this was through a process with a lot of testimony from experts that these two pilots should not have been in the cockpit that evening because they really weren't qualified to fly the plane. And we had an obligation, along with the families who were extraordinary. I mean, they never gave up. They were on Capitol Hill on a regular basis to do something about it. So I am concerned that with the change in House leadership, you have a chairman of the Transportation Committee saying he's not particularly in agreement with the 1,500 hours. Look, that's part of law now. And we will do everything we can to fight to ensure that it stays that way. And, it's not coincidental that in that period of time, there has not been a major fatality as it relates to commercial planes. So I think it works. And these were pilots, would come in and provide testimony, and those people that are concerned about the flying public and their safety. So I think we have to ensure that that stays. There's no reason to get rid of it.
Sort of a delicate balance, though, isn't it that, are they talking about the inability to get enough pilots and enough staff and all that?
I think that's used as, I think some have used this training requirement as a scapegoat for other problems in the industry. Look, airlines make a lot of money. They do very, very well. Congress's responsibility through the Aviation Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, is to ensure that the flying public is safe. So you have this terrible accident in Buffalo, and the National Transportation Safety Board concludes that it was pilot error and issues of rest or lack of rest that were major contributors to that crash. You've got to do something about it. And if a Southwest pilot is required to have 1,500 hours of flight training, why shouldn't a continental regional carrier have those same qualifications? I mean, they're not arbitrary. It's determined that that is a reasonable period of time within which pilots get trained and are capable of dealing with circumstances in the cockpit. The families were extraordinary. These were people that lost kids, that lost mothers and fathers and grandparents. The first thing they said to me when they came to Washington was, we don't blame the pilots. We blame the policy that allowed those pilots to be in the cockpit when they weren't qualified to fly a plane. So I think the industry, the airline industry, should work with Congress and not fight and try to reverse what took more than a decade to get done. It's not easy to change these rules, and you have to provide compelling evidence that this is something that's intended to remedy a problem out there, and that's the potential for people that are not qualified to fly planes are flying planes.
Thank you.
Thanks much. So Ron, how long has this been here?
Yes, sir.
You got it.
I got you, Chris.
Thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, man.